Finland formally announces its intention to join NATO. We'll have reaction from the Kremlin as ground fighting intensifies in eastern Ukraine. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. Both Finland's president and prime minister endorsed Helsinki joining NATO as soon as possible. The prospect of Finnish membership could pave the way for another historic expansion of the US-led military alliance. The Kremlin says the move poses a direct threat to Russia. CGTN's Michael Voss begins our coverage with this report from Helsinki.
Finns have a reputation for reticence, so the announcement of a major foreign policy U-turn ending decades of détente to join NATO came in a written statement, not a televised address. Signed by both the President and the Prime Minister, it said that NATO membership would strengthen Finland's security and strengthen the entire defence alliance, and that Finland must apply without delay. Speaking earlier, President Niinistö said that this was purely a defensive move.
For us, joining NATO would be not against anybody. We would like to maximize our security in way or another while thinking membership in NATO. But it is not a zero-sum game. If Finland increases its security, it's not away from anybody else.
President Putin, though, doesn't see it that way. He believes NATO expansion poses a direct threat to Russian security. It's one reason he launched his attack on Ukraine. Now he's threatening military and political repercussions if Finland and Sweden join.
We can expect a lot of hostile statements from Russia. We can expect then some hybrid interference. So intimidation of different types, military exercises, perhaps missile tests, talking up the nuclear threat, hybrid interference, cyber attacks, malware, etc. So nobody in Finland is expecting this to be an easy ride.
Finland shares a 1,300-kilometre border with Russia, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Arctic, which will double the length of NATO's border with Russia. Finland has a large, well-trained army that has long cooperated with NATO through its Progress for Peace programme. But now, looking at Ukraine, it apparently feels it needs the protection full NATO membership offers, where an attack on one is an attack on all. On Wednesday, Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson signed security pacts with both Sweden and Finland, offering support against any Russian threats, while these Nordic countries wait to be accepted into NATO. That process could take another year. We're now waiting to hear if Sweden will join NATO as well, a decision which could come in the next few days. Michael Voss, CGTN, Helsinki.
For more now on the conflict in Ukraine, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Lviv is Pavlo Kukhta. He's the former Ukrainian acting minister of the economy. From North Carolina, Klaus Larres is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs with the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and author of Uncertain Allies, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Threat of a United Europe. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University, and from Moscow, Dmitry Babich is a journalist and Russian political analyst. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Dmitry Babich, let me start with you. Finland says that it's going to move ahead with its application for membership of NATO. The Kremlin is calling this a direct threat to Russia. Here is the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov.
We have said many times that NATO's expansion and bringing its military infrastructure closer to our borders will not make the world, and most of all, our Eurasian continent, more stable and secure. That's obvious.
So, Dmitry, President Putin's goal was to push back on NATO's expansion, but now he's going to have another country that's going to join NATO, a country with an 800-mile border with Russia, or 1,300 kilometers. It's right on the border. How will President Putin respond to this?
Well, very easily. It's enough to look at the news during the last 5 to 6 years. De facto, Finland has become a NATO member, and a very hostile NATO member towards Russia. Let me just give you the statistics. There were dozens of military exercises conducted in both Sweden and Finland in the last 4 or 5 years. And in all of them, Russia was, the potential enemy. It was not hidden that these exercises were against Russia. Of course, they called them defensive, but everyone understands that, NATO would not be just on the defensive if there is a conflict with Russia. And also, let me tell you that certainly Putin included it in his calculations when not only him, but certainly there was a group of people who decided to take military action against Ukraine. It was obvious that this would be one of the consequences. But in fact, it's in a way, it's even better to have an open enemy than to have a formally neutral country which poses as neutral, but in reality is very hostile. Just look at the statements from the Finnish leaders in the last 8 years, since 2014. Basically, Finland started talking about joining NATO in the 90s. And if you look at the recent newspapers, in January, there was a meeting between the leaders of Finland and NATO on joining NATO. So even before the war in Ukraine started, this phase of the war started, Finland was ready to join and held negotiations on that. So nothing changed in that sense.
How is President Putin going to respond to this?
Well, in the same way as before, certainly Russia will strengthen its Western front. Let me tell you that in the, not only in the late 90s, but also under Putin in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk that Russia needed to dismantle the Western front, that more emphasis should be put on the southern borders of Russia, bordering on the Islamic world. But reality has shown that modern West is ruled by a very radical, aggressive ideology. We have seen it at work in many wars around the world, beginning from Yugoslavia, ending with Syria and Libya. So obviously, thank God, we didn't dismantle the Western Front, and we shall be strengthening it asymmetrically. We're not going to spend the same amount of money as NATO, because NATO, only the European allies of NATO spend 4 times more than Russia on their defense. Certainly, we're not going to attack them, but we're going to have enough forces to dissuade them from attacking us. And Ukraine, the example of Ukraine, has shown that we're serious about it.
Okay. Klaus, Larres, Finland says this is a defensive move, but let's look at the possible implications of Finnish membership. NATO will have a country right on Russia's border, which has a border with Russia, which is 800 miles long, 1,300 kilometers, which would enable the United States to position its troops, its missiles, its nuclear bombs right up along an 800-mile border. Will this keep the peace, or could it lead us down the path to World War III?
Well, this is a symbolic move. If one listened to Mr. Babich, one would believe that Finland and Sweden were about to attack Russia as soon as they become members of NATO. This is, of course, utter nonsense. Sweden and Finland have been integrated in NATO to some extent already. They allow NATO troops to be based transitionary on their territory, and they have close links to the Western, to the transatlantic alliance. That is what they do now, applying for NATO membership. That is in direct reaction to Putin's aggressive war on Ukraine. If Mr. Putin hadn't invaded Ukraine, Finland and Sweden would not have dreamt of applying for NATO membership. So the initiative really came from Putin, and that pushed Finland and Sweden into this direction. I don't think it will lead to World War III at all. I think nothing much will happen. Putin knows that Finland and Sweden doesn't want to attack Russia, and the Finns and the Swedes will, of course, be very careful in their military posture and what they want to do. And we haven't heard whether or not the United States wants to base, let's say, nuclear weapons in Finland and Sweden. Personally, I very much doubt that that is the intention, but we haven't heard about it.
Right, but the United States will be entitled to do that. I mean, I take your point about the Swedes and the Finns not wanting to attack Russia now or after membership in NATO, but the United States will be entitled to put its troops and its weapons right on the border with Russia, wouldn't they?
Not without permission of Sweden and Finland. The NATO alliance doesn't mean that individual member states give up their sovereignty. If they agree to having American missiles and nuclear weapons based on their territory, that could happen. But of course, the Finns and the Swedes, as anyone else in NATO, has to actually agree to that. And so the United States cannot do what it wants only because a country has become a member state of NATO. And that also will apply to Finland and Sweden.
Okay, Anton, Fedyashin, how will Finland's membership and possibly Sweden's membership of NATO change the strategic balance in Northern Europe?
Anton, it doesn't change the strategic balance in Northern Europe for all of the reasons that, by the way, both Klaus and Dmitry have already mentioned. Sweden and Finland had de facto been aligned with NATO, although not its members. And therefore, there will be a conceptual shift in the sense that both countries will receive the Article 5 guarantee, essentially, right, the commitment of the other members of NATO to defend them if they are attacked. Beyond that, they've been training through the Partnership for Peace program with NATO for years. So this doesn't change much at all, unless, of course, the Russians decide to, pick up and attack Finland, which I seriously doubt. But there are two interesting ramifications that neither of the previous speakers has mentioned. One, of course, is the future of the Baltic. This region is going to become more militarized. And in the Russian news today already, there was talk about building up the island fortress of Kronstadt, which guards the approach to St. Petersburg in the Gulf of Finland. And then there's the other side of Scandinavia, and that's the implications for the Arctic. All sides in the Arctic have been conducting massive military exercises, NATO in Norway. When Finland joins, which in my opinion is simply a formality now, a question of time, then there'll be more of a presence of NATO in the Arctic. Will NATO and the Russians be able to navigate a peaceful future for the Arctic? We'll have to wait and see. Right. But my final comment here is that again, to bring it back to Ukraine, this is in a sense an ironic message for the Ukrainians. It is a defeat for Putin. It's the boomerang effect on the one hand. On the other hand, from Ukraine's perspective, here's a country whose leadership wanted badly to get into NATO. They started being maneuvered into NATO's sphere of influence, but without the guarantees. And they're now going to watch the Finns and the Swedes sort of rocket into the ranks of NATO, and the actual war and where NATO is most needed is in Ukraine, which I suppose, if you're a pessimist in Ukraine, is an indication that ultimately Ukraine matters not as a member of NATO, but as something else.
Pavlo Kukhta, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, he's been praising Finland for its move, its wanting to join NATO. And according to Russia, the conflict that's taking place in Ukraine right now is about NATO membership, is about Ukraine's potential NATO membership. But this move on the part of Finland and possibly on the part of Sweden, what does that do for Ukraine?
Look, I think anything that can serve as a bulwark against Russian stupidity and miscalculation, forgive me for using these words, in Eastern Europe will help. Because, of course, if Ukraine was under the umbrella of the Article 5 of NATO, Russia would probably not have attacked, and the world would not have all the problems we have now. Of course, Ukraine is suffering the most, but look at the food prices, look at the hunger problems that will eventually layer up because of this war. Look at all the mess that's been created by without achieving anything. The Russians are essentially being driven out right now in military terms. So they have miscalculated hugely. They are not very competent in what they're doing, yet they are very aggressive. This is a dangerous situation that has to be diffused somehow. And if extending the NATO Article 5 umbrella to neutral countries helps that, clearly keeps the Russians out and keeps their aggression at bay, I think that would enhance the security for everyone. So it is definitely helpful. Again, we're dealing with a country that is not only very aggressive, but also quite incompetent at its aggression. And it only creates problems along the way for everyone, including itself. So yes, I think this move is good for Ukraine. And yes, I very much agree that, of course, Ukraine also needs to be brought out of the gray zone where it, in terms of security, where it was present before the war and which led to the war, because there was no clear security arrangement that protected Ukraine from aggression. Ultimately, Ukraine was in this protected by its own armed forces, who are successfully defending the country and pushing the Russians out. But this is not a way to keep stable peace. It's a way to beat the Russians back, but it does not create a situation which is stable and workable for everyone. It only creates problems for the world. So yes, I'm quite happy, and I think all Ukrainians are quite happy for the Finns, and I think Ukraine should also be brought under that umbrella, and that would at least keep within their borders.
Dmitry Babich, there was a report in the New York Times earlier this week, and it was uncharacteristically a report with candor. And this is what the New York Times reported. It said that Russia has made gains on the ground, advancing right up to the border between Luhansk and Donetsk. The report says this gives Russia enormous leverage in negotiating an end to the conflict. What's the goal here for Russia?
Well, I think the goal changed, and I don't see anything unusual about it. Let me remind you that when the Allied armies basically conquered the Nazi Germany, it was not immediately clear what the future for the country would be. You know, there was the Morgenthau plan, which was to make Germany an agrarian country. Stalin obviously wanted to make it what Finland became later, kind of a country connecting the Soviet zone and the West. So it was not clear what would happen. Finally, it boiled down to GDR and West Germany. In the same way here, probably the initial hope of the Russian General Staff was that there would be a more or less painless regime change with the paratroopers taking Kiev and being aided by troops advancing from Belarus. But if that plan ever existed, it was dropped a few weeks ago. Russia decided to concentrate on the areas which are populated by the Russian-speaking population in the south of the country, in the east of the country. And the plan is obviously to defeat the professional part of the Ukrainian army. Yeah. Basically to take out the people who can use these sophisticated weapons which had been flooding Ukraine before Russian attack and which are flooding Ukraine now. Right. So this is, I think, the plan right now, and I think it is realistic. But in general, of course, people in Russia do not perceive it as a war between Russia and Ukraine. They perceive it as a war between Russia and the West, not only NATO, because obviously Finland and Sweden are hostile. Switzerland basically joined Western sanctions and confiscated the property of private individuals. So in that sense, of course, it's a war with the West, which Russia did not start, which the West started long ago. And we're going to withstand that war.
All right, let me go to Pavlo. Pavlo, what do you make of that assessment by the New York Times that Russia has made gains on the ground? We even have the top U.S. intelligence official telling Congress here in Washington that this will be, quote, a prolonged conflict.
Well, the report might well be accurate because indeed we see very limited changes in the front lines, but those that are happening are actually the other way around. So today, Ukrainian military reached the border with Russia in Kharkiv region, and generally the Russian troops have been driven away from the city of Kharkiv, which they were shelling for the last 2 months since the start of the war. They have tried to encircle a portion of Ukrainian troops in the east, in the Severodonetsk area. They've established a bridgehead over Donetsk River to do that, and this bridgehead has been destroyed today with major loss of life and vehicles for the Russian military. So essentially they're being slowly driven back by the Ukrainian armed forces. This might take a while indeed, so perhaps several months, though we will see. But of course, the assessment that the Russians are somehow destroying the professional component of Ukrainian armed forces simply does not hold to any kind of reality. What is getting destroyed is actually the Russian military. We weren't there down using 1960s technology right now. The missiles flying at Ukrainian cities were actually produced way back in the Soviet days by now. And they've started with modern weapons. So they are the ones who are getting pummeled here, not the other way around.
Anton, you know, when I read that New York report, I remembered something that you told us on this show a couple of weeks ago. You said that the goal of the Russian campaign at that stage was to get to the administrative border of Donetsk and Luhansk. What are your thoughts now on what Russia is planning and how it will possibly use these territorial gains in future negotiations?
Well, to judge by the information that the Institute for the Study of War, for example, is publishing on a daily basis, the Russians are slowly moving towards those administrative borders, which I'll remind our viewers are well beyond the borders of the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So the Russian army has gained together with, by the way, the militias of the Luhansk and Donetsk, so-called People's Republics, they've gained plenty of ground. And although the movement has slowed down, they're still moving towards those borders. To the best of our knowledge today, and this is the best that we all can do is judge by official statements, annexation does not seem to be in the immediate cards. As a matter of fact, just at the end of last week, Donetsk and Luhansk have moved forward in setting up embassies in Russia. So it looks like those two republics within their new borders, if they can be secured, will be first recognized as independent states. In other words, the Kosovo, South Ossetia, Abkhazia scenario. The same, the Russians are hoping to do with Kherson, the province that is immediately to the north of the Crimea, and they're probably going to try to hold on to that because it has the North Crimean Canal that connects the Dnieper River running through it, and that's where the Crimea gets its water. So it looks like unrecognized independence, but beyond that, it's very difficult to speculate at this point.
Okay. Klaus, Larres, does it concern you that there isn't a single leader in NATO or in Moscow or in Kyiv that is talking about a diplomatic way to end this conflict, that's talking about a negotiated solution? All we're hearing about is more weapons for Ukraine, something which could prolong the war.
It does concern me. I mean, it is obvious that the Western alliance has to support Ukraine because without Western weapons, Ukraine would really not stand a chance against the overwhelming Russian might. But it does concern me that Macron's efforts to obtain a negotiated solution, the Turkish president's efforts, the Israeli efforts, and other people's efforts have all come to nothing. There's not much talk about a mediated solution right now. Of course, what is all important in the end in war is what the situation is like on the battlefield. That is certainly important. However, diplomatic efforts should be following that. And we have just heard that Putin probably wishes to obtain the wider Donbass area, eastern Ukraine, and perhaps then he is happy with what he has achieved and some sort of negotiated solution might be possible. This is, of course, not acceptable to the Ukrainians, but at least it would be the basis for getting together at the negotiating table and see what can be done. And of course, we all wish that for the time being, the most urgent aim is to overcome the war, to end the war, and to obtain a peace and ceasefire. and that no one is trying to make an effort right now to achieve that is very sad. And of course, the leading protagonist, Zelensky, and above all Putin, who actually started the war, of course, it was not the West, as Mr. Babich said, who started the war. The invasion of Ukraine was done by Putin and by Russia. So they have also the major responsibility to bring forward a negotiated solution. And I would say that is highly urgent.
Just on one point there, Klaus, I mean, do you, if this continues, there is a belief, which I've heard from Ukrainians as well as from members of NATO, that this conflict will be settled on the battlefield. It'll be settled with the defeat of Russia. Do you see that happening?
That could well be, but turn it the other way around. Would it be better to have a defeat of Ukraine? In a way, we don't want to see the clear defeat of anyone.
Right.
Putin has to come out of the war with not having lost total faith, clearly, because he wants, otherwise he will not end the war. He will not agree to an end to the war. Yep. But neither side should clearly lose the war. How to achieve that? That is the role of mediators and maybe neutral countries in between who can try to talk to both sides. But there is a likelihood that Russian incompetence and Russian 1960s technology, as we just heard, will actually mean that the Russians will not defeat Ukraine. And that is a likelihood. Yeah.
All right, let me get Dmitry's response to that. Dmitry, what do you make of that? And also, Klaus pointed out that it wasn't Ukraine that started this war, or the West that started this war, it was Russia.
Well, let me remind you and Klaus that actually for 8 years, the two areas in Ukraine populated by ethnic Russians have been bombarded by Ukrainian army. 14,000 people died there. Before that, I was in Kiev during the Maidan, and I can tell you it was a real war in which 38 policemen were murdered and hundreds maimed. It was certainly a war which led to the ousting of the legally elected president, whose election in 2010 was recognized by the United States and NATO and the European Union. And he was ousted violently. And the West said it was a huge victory for democracy, and it was peaceful, and it was nice. So, Klaus, believe me, you are not going to deceive anyone here. And especially when you insult the Russians, it's not going to gain you many points. As for the future, I think it will be sooner or later decided at the negotiating table, especially when Mr. Zelensky gets his act together and stops changing his attitudes. If you look at his statements on the second day of the fighting, he said that he was fine with neutrality for Ukraine.
Yeah. Okay.
Then he dropped it in the evening of the same day. In Istanbul, the Ukrainian delegation said that it was fine, with them not to include the Ukraine in NATO and neutrality and guarantors of peace. And then suddenly they changed their position, and there was no. Russia was ready for further meetings, but Ukrainians didn't show up. So
sorry, Dmitry, I have to interrupt you there. Dmitry, I have to interrupt you. My apologies. We have run out of time, but thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.